All right, let's talk about accessibility and Annex J of the National Electrical Code. And for the purposes of this discussion, when we talk about accessibility, we're not talking about accessibility as it's defined in Article 100, whether that's just accessible for equipment or wiring methods or readily accessible. What we're talking about is accessibility as it's defined in the Building Code, which is accessible for people with disabilities, and that's what Annex J talks about. So to kind of start out as an overview, the informational notes in 110.1, 210.50, and 210.52C3 refer to Annex J, which contains a few provisions from the ADA Standards for Accessible Design and the ICC ANSI A117.1, Accessible and Usable Buildings and Facilities. Now, those are informational notes, and Annex J obviously is an annex, and if you look at section 90.5C of the NEC, you'll find that both informational notes and annexes are not enforceable parts of the code. So does that mean that the provisions that we're going to talk about today are not enforceable? Absolutely not. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law and has been ever since 1990. So the fact that it's an annex and referenced by informational notes does not mean that it's unenforceable. These are most of the requirements we're going to talk about today actually come from the International Building Code. So 110.1 in the NEC starts out by saying that Article 110 contains the general requirements for examination, approval, installation, access and spaces around equipment, as well as manholes and tunnels. So Article 110, of course, covers the general requirements for electrical installations. And before you even get into it, there's an informational note that tells us to take a look at Annex J for information about accessibility for people with disabilities. And one of the things that drives me crazy is this symbol, and this is known as the International Symbol of Accessibility. I think it doesn't do itself any favors. And by that I mean that all of us, to a certain extent, myself included, when we think about accessibility for people with disabilities, we immediately think of a person in a wheelchair. Again, the symbol doesn't help that. But it's worth pointing out that we provide access for people with all manner of disabilities. For example, I often use my father-in-law Bruce as an example. Bruce has had rheumatoid arthritis pretty much his entire life. And after 50 years of it, his hands look like this. They're claws. And in addition to that, he's not quite bound to a wheelchair now, but pretty close. Moving around is difficult. His joints bend in just terrible directions that they were never intended to bend. But accessibility is something that accommodates people like Bruce, even though he's not in a wheelchair. Things like his hands, for example. If you go in a commercial building, there's a reason that you don't see doorknobs that would require me to grab it with an open hand and twist it with my wrist. It's because if you have an amputee or if you have crippling arthritis, like my father-in-law, you can't use that facility. So you'll see that they have levered hardware instead, so that I can just hit it with my hand and push or pull it without any additional effort. So accessibility is not just for people in wheelchairs, people with hand disabilities, people with mobility disabilities, obviously, people with vision impairment, if you're blind, if you're hard of hearing, if you shuffle your feet, if you use a walker, if you use crutches. All sorts of disabilities are addressed in the Americans with Disabilities Act and by the International Building Code and the ICC ANSI A117.1. Now, I want to point out that if all you do is single-family dwellings, then you don't need to do any of this stuff. For single-family dwellings, we really don't have any accessibility requirements. But if you do commercial facilities, or if you do apartments, or hotels and motels, or even to a lesser extent if you do townhouses, then we have accessibility requirements that we need to satisfy. Now, this is from the International Building Code. It starts out by saying that sites, buildings, structures, facilities, elements, spaces, everything has to be accessible to people that have disabilities. Everything within the scope of the IBC. And that's why I say it does not include single-family dwellings, because single-family is covered by the IRC, the International Residential Code, not the International Building Code. But if you fall into the scope of the IBC, then everything in the building, all the sites, all the facilities, everything in it must be accessible. And accessible means that it complies with ANSI A117.1. That's a book that tells you what accessible means. That tells you where, how wide your hallways need to be, different things like that. And we're going to talk about that. Now, I want to be really clear on this. The purpose of this video and this discussion is it's limited to mainly electricians. It's not intended, if you already know a lot about accessibility, then this might not do you a lot of good. I'm not going to get into what percentage of apartments need to be type A units versus type B units versus fully accessible. So we're not going to get into the minutia of that. We're just going to keep things kind of general. So the IBC starts out by saying, look, everything has to be accessible to people with disabilities. And that's why in the picture here I've got vertical access. I've got my elevator, I've got an escalator. These things are both components of accessible routes. And they're intended to get people with mobility disabilities up to the second floor, obviously. So there are some blanket exceptions in the IBC. And the first one, and probably the most common, is employee work areas. Employee work areas only need accessible common use circulation paths where I have multiple people traveling down the same path. And they must allow individuals with disabilities to approach, enter, and exit the work area. So looking at this photograph here, this is an individual's work area. We've got a door here that has to be accessible. So I need to have at least a 32-inch wide door, a 3-foot door, and I have to allow people to enter and exit and approach the workspace. As far as the height of devices, the graspability of equipment, that's not regulated here in the employee work area. Now, an employee work area, though, is defined, and that's all or any portion of a space used only by employees and only for work. So here we have a commercial kitchen that would only be used for by employees and only for work. I'm not going to do anything else in that commercial kitchen besides employee work. So that would be an employee work area. What's the height of this work surface? How deep is the sink? Can I get a wheelchair under the sink? None of these things would apply because that's an employee work area. Now, I need you to be careful on this and try not to take advantage of it, because some areas that might seem like an employee work area might not be. In an office building, for example, individual cubicles, individual offices, or even the big cubicle farm, those might be employee work areas. But some things like a conference room may or may not be. I know when I was working as an inspector, when we would have like a birthday party or a retirement party or things like that, you know, where you'd get together and eat cake and coffee and ice cream and whatnot for a half hour, we would do that in our conference room. Now, it was only for employees, but that was not for work. That was for purposes that were not work-related. So that is not an employee work area. Or if we had a member of the public coming in, we would have a consultation for a building permit question or something. Once the public is there, it's no longer an employee work area. So try not to take advantage of this. It doesn't apply quite as carte blanche as you might think. Now, it goes on to say that corridors, toilet rooms, kitchenettes, and break rooms are not employee work areas. Now, this is a full-blown kitchen here. This is at a restaurant. If I have an office building and it has a break area / kitchenette, that's not an employee work area. Even if it's for employees only, that's not for work. Bathrooms, for example, not an employee work area. So the height of that receptacle would be regulated. The space underneath the sink would be regulated, whether or not I have protection under the sink from burns and abrasion. The depth of the countertop, whether I have a receptacle, the height of the mirror, all of that stuff would be regulated. How high is that toilet, the paper towel dispenser? That would all be regulated because that is not an employee work area, so it has to be accessible. One that's important for electricians to understand is spaces frequented only by service personnel for maintenance, repair, or occasional monitoring of equipment are not required to be accessible, and that's a big deal. So here we've got this equipment room. Now, given the nature of this facility, it's probably an employee work area, but even if it wasn't, this would only be utilized by service personnel, electricians, maintenance, repair, things of that nature. So none of this would have to be accessible. It would be pretty tough if the maximum height for all of the equipment in this MCC was 48 and the lowest was 15. It would be next to impossible. Going in a little bit deeper, we have occupancy type R1, which is hotels, motels, and apartments. In other words, not apartments. Hotels and motels. Scratch the apartments. A certain percentage of units must be accessible. So you've probably all been in hotels where you've got the accessible units with the roll-in shower and everything else. Those have to be full-blown accessible. The other units do not. So R1 is actually pretty easy. Where it gets a little bit trickier is R2, which is apartments, not hotels and motels. For R2, some units must be accessible, but all units must be either type A or type B if more than 4 units exist in a single building. Now, I'm not going to get into type A and type B too specifically, but let me just say that there's essentially 2 concepts here. We have full-blown accessible. If I'm in an accessible apartment, that means that my toilet room has 5 feet, it has grab bars, I've got a roll-in shower or a transfer shower, full-blown 100% accessible. Type A and Type B you could almost look at and call adaptable. In other words, I don't have to have the grab bars in the toilet rooms, but I do have to have backing in the walls so that I could mount grab bars if I ever needed them. My toilet has to be 16 to 18 inches away from the wall, but it doesn't have to be 17 to 19 inches tall. The reason for that is moving it farther away from the wall or closer to the wall is very difficult. That would require an extensive amount of remodeling. But changing the toilet to one that's taller or shorter is easy enough. I can rip out the toilet and replace it. So Type A or Type B are essentially adaptable units where I can make them accessible without ripping the building apart. So if we look at this again, some units in apartments have to be accessible, but all units have to be at least Type A or Type B, adaptable, if you have more than 4 units in a single building. Now that's generally speaking. There are some exceptions to that, so be aware. For example, if no elevator service is provided in a structure, only the units on accessible stories are required to be Type A or Type B units respectively. So here I've got some apartments. They're not going to have elevators in them. All of my accessible units are on the first floor. That means the units above do not have to be Type A or Type B. Now again, it's not my intent to really go through what has to be accessible and what doesn't. You're better off talking to your building inspector, your plans examiner, your architect, but I do want to just kind of give you a general overview of what the requirements are. Now, once we've established that we're in an area that needs to be accessible, commercial buildings, apartments on the main floor, Type A or Type B units, what are the requirements? This is where you can go to Annex J in the back of the code book and you can see the rules. The first one is for protruding objects such as wall sconces. They must not encroach more than 4 inches in the area between 27 and 80 inches above the floor. This is not for people in wheelchairs. It's not for people in crutches. This is for people that are blind, that use a cane to guide them. You've probably either seen in person or on TV someone that uses a cane to navigate. And there's 2 main approaches that they'll use. Sometimes they'll tap straight down, but much more commonly, of course, they use like a sweeping motion, back and forth motion. So the idea with the protruding object, if I have something that sticks out from the wall and it's lower than 27 inches, my cane will hit it and it will let me know that there's an obstruction. If I have something that's higher than 80 inches, that's 6'8". There's not too many of us that are above 6'8". So, look, we can't accommodate everybody. If you're blind and you're 6'9" and taller, I'm sorry, but we can't possibly accommodate every person on the planet. So we accommodate people that are shorter than 6'8". If I have a wall sconce sticking out, let's say I've got a wall sconce that sticks out 6 inches, you can see what's going to happen here. I'm walking with my cane, it's up high, lower than 6'8", maybe it's 5'8", and my cane obviously doesn't see it, and I'm walking and I face plant right into it. That's the issue with protruding objects. I'm here to tell you, every commercial building that you walk into has a violation of this rule. Every building. Whether it's wall sconces, fire extinguishers, drinking fountains, AED defibrillators, wall-mounted TVs, freestanding desks. There are all sorts of violations of this rule. We as electricians, we need to know about it mainly for wall sconces. So if you're doing a commercial building and you've got wall sconces, You need to get a cut sheet on that wall sconce, and you need to find out how far that thing sticks out. If it sticks out less than 4 inches, beautiful. You can put it wherever you want. If it sticks out more than 4 inches, then you need to make sure that no part of it hangs lower than 80 inches. So be quite careful on that. I wrote this up as an inspector all the time. Very, very common violation. So here in this photograph, we have a violation. When this building was built, it was not a violation. I do want to emphasize that. This is actually one of the clients that I teach for. But you've got these wall sconces that stick out more than 4 inches. They are above 27. They're lower than 6'8", 80 inches. So that's a violation. They're not allowed to stick out more than 4 inches. So be careful on the protrusion limits, 4 inches in the area between 27 and 80. And you also need to accommodate reach ranges. The unobstructed reach range for accessible installations is 15 to 48. Now we'll talk about what unobstructed means. 15 to 48. If I'm in a wheelchair, I cannot reach lower than 15 inches. If I have dwarfism, I can't reach higher than 48. Or if I'm in a wheelchair, I might not be able to reach higher than 48. So all operable parts need to be between 15 and 48. Now again, let's talk about those exceptions. The general requirements were that everything has to be accessible. Employee work areas do not. So inside this guy's office, we're okay. In this corridor, well, we've got regulations. Operable parts like light switches, thermostats, receptacles, they must not be any higher than 48 and no lower than 15. Thermostats is a very common violation. The typical height that I see is 5 feet. If you want to put it 5 feet in your own office, be my guest. If you want to put it 5 feet in a hallway, no can do. It's got to be accessible. Another example, we talked about apartments. If I'm doing apartments and they're accessible, or type A, or type B, maximum and minimum reach range has to be accommodated. That would include receptacles, light switches, thermostats. That would even include circuit breakers. And in fact, it specifically says that it includes circuit breakers. So here we've got a panel board where the highest circuit breaker is 48 inches. That is a requirement. It seems very low, and perhaps it is. But that is the requirement. No lower than 15, no higher than 48. If I have to reach over something, if I have an obstruction, if you're in a chair, or even if you're standing up, if you reach out in front of you, your hand goes down, whether you like it or not. If you have to reach across something, your hips bend and your hand goes down. So I can't reach as high if I have to reach out far. So the maximum height for obstructed reach is 48 inches for obstructions that are 10 to 20 inches deep. Now this is a forward reach where I'm reaching out in front of me. I can go up to 20 inches and still reach out 48, which makes sense. If you stick your arm out, you'll find that a 20-inch reach is not that much. But if I have to reach more than 20 inches, up to 25, that's where my arm starts to drop, and I would be limited to a 44-inch height. So this is something where you might have receptacles in a break room, for example. You might have countertop that's an obstruction. If you have a forward reach, you can go up to 20 inches without obstruction, and you can reach 48, but 20 to 25, your maximum is 48. For an obstructed high reach on a side approach or a parallel approach, it's not quite as bad, because when you reach out to the side, your arm doesn't go down quite as much. The maximum height for obstructed side reach is 48 for obstructions less than 10 inches deep. So if you have a 10-inch deep obstruction, it's essentially not an obstruction. 10 to 24 inches, however, your arm drops 2 inches, your maximum height is 46. So looking at this photograph here, the obstructed reach depends on forward versus side approach. So we would do what? We would measure the countertop, and we would also figure out if you can do a frontal approach or a side approach. In this, I believe we could probably do either in most of these areas. Side approach is probably the most comfortable. But it's also important to know that the height of this countertop in and of itself is regulated. 36 inches is the highest that the countertop could be. And therefore your receptacles tend to kind of take care of themselves. You know what I mean? It's not like you're going to have it 1.5 feet higher than the countertop. So usually that part of the issue is self-satisfying, but we would need to figure out how deep that obstruction is, and that would gauge how high my receptacle, light switch, garbage disposal switch, things like that, how high those could be. Things like a built-in microwave, pretty much out of the picture, right? That would not be allowed at all. If you had a microwave in this room, it would have to be on the counter. You can see how these ovens are down low. Perfect. Those meet for accessibility. So we have to make sure that we can reach these things. 15 to 48, highest and lowest reach range for operable parts. As always, if you're interested in the slides, go to my website, ryanjacksonelectrical.com. You can take a look at the changes book, or you can look at the comprehensive guide that has the entire code book more or less. I'm Ryan Jackson. That's my website. That's my email address. If you want to get a hold of me, please don't hesitate. I hope you guys got something out of this. Have a great day.